early in the 4th century after Christ. In the Roman province of Hispania, a young girl just 13 years old walked alone through the marble streets of Merida. Her sandals tapped against the polished stones as the sun rose above the city's majestic columns. Her name was Eulalia, and within a matter of hours this child would suffer one of the most horrifying executions ever recorded in the Roman Empire. According to ancient tradition, she endured 13 brutal tortures, one for every year of her life. Whether or not that number is literal doesn't really matter. What matters is the message. Her death was deliberately monstrous, meant to shock, terrify, and humiliate. But what could a little girl have possibly done to enrage the Roman authorities to such an extent? To understand Eulalia's fate, we need to understand the collapsing world around her. At the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was in chaos. Emperors were being overthrown or assassinated faster than coins could be minted with their faces on them. The frontiers were constantly under attack from barbarian tribes, the economy was falling apart, and trust in traditional Roman religion was waning. In the middle of all this turmoil, a new and quiet, but rapidly growing force was spreading through cities, villages, and even the military Christianity. Then came Emperor Diocletian, who took power in 284. He was convinced that all of Rome's problems, its wars, its famines, its instability were punishments from the old gods. Why? Because more and more people had stopped worshiping them and had turned to this new monotheistic and defiant religion. To fix this, Diocletian made a decision that would lead to thousands of deaths. He declared an all-out war on Christianity. In the year 303, Diocletian began what we now call the Great Persecution, the most brutal organized campaign against Christians the empire had ever seen. Churches were destroyed. Sacred texts were burned. Christians were rounded up and given a choice: renounce their faith or die. In the city of Merida, one of the most important urban centers in Roman Hispania, a girl named Eulalia lived with her family. Born around the year 291 into a wealthy Christian household, her parents were respected merchants. They taught her the faith in secret, quietly, carefully. They knew what would happen if the authorities discovered they were Christian. They hoped to keep their heads down and avoid attention. But Eulalia was different. Even as a young child, she showed an unusually strong spirit. While other kids played games and made dolls out of clay, Eulalia spent her time memorizing scriptures and discussing theology. Her parents were proud, of course, but they were also terrified. In an age of persecution, faith like that wasn't just dangerous. It was a death sentence. When Diocletian's orders finally reached Merida around the year 304, the city's governor Dacian received clear instructions from the top. Every Christian was to make public sacrifices to the Roman gods or face execution. The temples were reopened in grand ceremonies. Animal sacrifices were made daily, and any person who refused to take part was immediately exposed as a follower of Christ. Eulalia's parents were desperate to protect her. They whisked her away to a rural estate outside the city, hoping that the remote countryside would keep her safe, but they hadn't counted on their daughter's fierce convictions. Eulalia wasn't afraid. In fact, she saw the persecution not as something to avoid, but as a moment to prove her loyalty to Christ. On a cold December morning in 304, Eulalia slipped away from the estate. Alone, she walked for hours through the countryside, barefoot on dirt roads, until she reached the center of Merida. But she wasn't going home. Her destination was the governor's palace. A 13-year-old girl had made the decision to turn herself in. The guards were stunned. Here was a well-dressed child, obviously from a wealthy family, boldly requesting to speak to the governor. Dacian, intrigued by the strange request, ordered her to be brought inside. What happened next would echo through the centuries. Eulalia entered the palace like she owned the room. Despite her small frame and delicate appearance, she walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Her dark hair was braided neatly. Her eyes were sharp and unflinching. The governor looked her over, clearly puzzled. "Why have you come here, child?" he asked. And Eulalia's reply shook the room. "I have come to confess that I am a Christian, and to denounce the blasphemy of your false gods." The silence that followed was heavy. This wasn't a frightened child. This was a declaration of war, spiritual war from a teenage girl. Dacian tried a softer approach. He thought maybe she was just confused. "You're too young to understand," he said. "Go back to your family. Make a sacrifice to the gods, and all will be forgiven." But Eulalia wouldn't back down. She walked across the room to a corner altar dedicated to the Roman gods. In front of everyone, she spat on the statues. She kicked the sacred offerings to the floor. And then, with the whole court watching, she said, "Your gods are demons. Only Christ is true." The room erupted. Guards rushed toward her, but Dacian stopped them. He needed to think. This wasn't just an act of blasphemy, it was a public challenge to Roman authority. If a child could defy the gods of Rome so openly, what message would that send? He made his decision. Eulalia would be made an example. Her death would be a spectacle, a warning to others. She was thrown into a cell, and the next morning, the city was ready. In the public square, a huge crowd gathered. Word had spread fast a noble girl, a child, had insulted the gods and challenged the governor. People came for different reasons. Some were simply curious. Others wanted blood. And many Christians came too, forced to watch, to be reminded of what would happen if they dared to resist Rome. When Eulalia was brought out, the crowd gasped. She was so young, small, frail, dressed in a plain tunic, but she stood tall. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Her eyes were just as defiant. Dacian stepped onto a raised platform and addressed the crowd. "This girl has blasphemed against the gods of Rome," he declared. "Her punishment will serve as a lesson to all." And with that, the tortures began. The crowd held its breath. No one had expected the Roman authorities to go this far, not with a child. But what followed was one of the most vicious executions in Roman history. Ancient accounts, especially from the 4th century poet Prudentius, describe the scene in disturbing detail. Whether every moment happened exactly as written is debatable, but what's clear is this: the torture was real, and the horror was unforgettable. The first act was relatively restrained, at least by Roman standards. Eulalia was stripped and flogged with rods. Thin lashes tore into her skin, leaving long trails of blood down her back. But instead of screaming, she began to sing. Yes, sing. Ancient witnesses claimed she recited hymns, Christian psalms, her voice soft but unwavering. The second torture took it up a level. Iron hooks were dragged across her body, tearing into her arms and shoulders. The crowd, at first rowdy, started to quiet. What kind of child could endure this without breaking? Then came the third, burning torches pressed against her open wounds. Smoke rose from her skin. Some people turned away. But Eulalia still didn't beg. She kept singing. Fourth, coarse salt was rubbed into her wounds. Every grain of it seared like fire. Fifth, red-hot irons were pressed against her ribs, branding her flesh. The sixth torture involved pulling out her fingernails one by one. Blood dripped to the stone floor. But she never cried out. She bit her lip, face pale, hands trembling, but her resolve held. Then came the seventh. Boiling oil poured over her torn skin. Eulalia's song faltered now, her voice faint, breath shallow, but she kept going. The eighth torture focused on her feet. Sharp blades sliced the soles, a particularly cruel act meant to deepen suffering without killing. The ninth was even worse. Molten lead was poured onto her head. By the 10th torture, her hair was ripped out, chunks of scalp torn away with it. Her body trembled, her tunic was soaked in blood. But she never asked for mercy. Not once. The 11th act turned stomachs. Her breasts were slashed open with iron hooks. The 12th? Burning coals placed across her body, her stomach, thighs, neck. Her body was no longer that of a child. It was broken, blistered, bleeding, held together by nothing but willpower and faith. And yet she lived. But the 13th and final torture would finish what the others could not. A wooden pyre had been built in the center of the square. The Romans would burn her alive. She couldn't walk anymore. Her legs were mutilated. Her body could barely move. So the guards tied her to the stake at the center of the pyre, binding her ruined body upright. As the flames were lit and started creeping toward her feet, something happened that no one could explain. According to Prudentius and later Christian tradition, as the fire consumed her, a white dove flew out from her mouth, a pure, bright dove rising above the flames into the sky, For believers, it was her soul, released from pain, rising to heaven. For Roman officials, it was a chilling omen. Even in death, Eulalia had defied them. The crowd was stunned. Some crossed themselves. Others ran. And just a few, began to whisper that maybe this girl really had been a saint. Dacian, watching from his platform, was furious. His plan had backfired. This was supposed to be a warning. Instead, it became something else, something he couldn't control. Eulalia's courage had stirred something dangerous, so he ordered silence. No one was to speak her name. No prayers. No songs. No stories. He even left her charred body in the square to rot, to be picked apart by animals. A final humiliation. But it didn't work. That night, under cover of darkness, a group of Christians crept into the square. They wrapped Eulalia's body in cloth, carried her out beyond the city walls, and buried her in secret. The grave wasn't marked at first, but the people knew. Word spread. And then the miracles began. Some who visited the burial site claimed to be healed. The blind said they could see. The sick said their fevers vanished. Whether true or not, the stories only grew stronger. Eulalia had become something more than a martyr. She had become a symbol. And the Roman government had a problem. Instead of scaring people into silence, Eulalia's death had inspired a new wave of believers. Adults who had hidden their faith now spoke out. More people were baptized. The underground Christian community in Hispania grew bolder. It didn't help that, less than a decade later, Emperor Constantine reversed everything. In the year 313, with the Edict of Milan, Christianity was legalized across the empire. Suddenly, the same faith that had gotten Eulalia killed was protected by imperial law. The girl who had been burned as a criminal now became a heroine. A basilica was built over her tomb. Her name was no longer whispered, it was shouted from the pulpit. She became Saint Eulalia, one of the most important figures in Spanish Christianity. Prudentius, writing decades later, composed poetic hymns that celebrated her courage. He called her a soldier of Christ, someone whose tiny body had withstood more than Roman soldiers could endure. Her story spread across the empire, carried by travelers, priests, and missionaries. In time, she became the patron saint of Merida and eventually one of the most beloved saints in all of Spain. Today, over 1,700 years later, the name Eulalia still carries weight. In Merida, her hometown, her story is everywhere, engraved in churches, echoed in prayers, remembered in quiet reflection and public celebration alike. Every December 10th, the city commemorates her feast day, honoring the teenage girl who defied the greatest empire in the world and died for her beliefs. But this isn't just a historical tale locked away in the past. Eulalia's legacy continues to challenge how we think about courage, conviction, and what it really means to stand for something. And let's be honest, this wasn't the kind of hero anyone would have expected. She wasn't a warrior. She didn't lead a rebellion. She didn't come from the clergy or the Senate. She was a child. That's part of what makes her story so powerful.